At her granddaughter's baby shower, she watched her husband whisper to the other grandmother, her daughter-in-law's mother. Then she pulled out the phone records, and what she revealed stopped the celebration cold. But that wasn't even the worst part. Marianne Wright had always thought she knew what betrayal looked like. It was cold, sharp, swift. But as she stood on the porch of her home in Maryland that crisp spring morning, holding a pink ribbon-tied baby shower invitation, she realized something far worse had been quietly blooming. Soft, sweet-smelling, and poisonous. The invitation had come from her daughter-in-law, Sophie. Marianne's son, James, and Sophie were expecting their first child, a baby girl. The shower was to be held at a grand country inn. The guest list included both families, Marianne, of course, and Sophie's mother, Diana Langford. Diana. Just the thought made Marianne's fingers twitch against the paper. To everyone else, Diana was charm and grace wrapped in designer silk. She smiled like she was lit from within. But Marianne had always felt a thin layer of something fake in Diana's presence, like perfume covering rot. Still, she had always kept her suspicions to herself. After all, Diana was the mother of her grandchild-to-be. There was no point stirring unease. At 71, Marianne had learned to choose silence over suspicion. Life had taught her that not every shadow needed a name, but in recent months, her husband David had changed. He started attending volunteer events with more frequency, dressed sharper, and came home smelling of unfamiliar cologne, and sometimes faint traces of jasmine, the same scent Diana always wore. It was subtle at first, missed calls, late-night phone charges, a receipt from a boutique Marianne had never stepped foot in. She didn't want to believe it, not after 43 years, not after children, illnesses, anniversaries, and burying his mother together. But doubt doesn't need volume to grow. It festers in quiet corners. When she mentioned the baby shower to David, he hesitated. It was slight, barely a hitch, but it was there. "Oh, is Diana going to be there?" he asked, casually pouring coffee like he hadn't just ripped the air in two. "Of course she is. She's the grandmother," Marianne replied, watching him too closely. He nodded, then muttered something about checking his calendar. He never missed family events. That night she didn't sleep. She sat in the soft yellow glow of her kitchen lamp, watching old photos on her phone. She stopped at one, David holding her during their 40th anniversary dance, his face open, loving, and she wept. Not because she had proof, but because she didn't need it. The next morning she called her friend Cora, who had a nephew in IT. Quietly, cautiously, she asked for help accessing David's phone records. Just the numbers, nothing else. It took 3 days. When the list arrived, Marianne stared at it in silence. Diana's number appeared 86 times over the past 2 months. Once at 1:12 a.m., she didn't scream. She didn't confront. She just folded the paper neatly and placed it under a napkin in her drawer. She would wait for the baby shower, not because she wanted revenge, but because she needed truth, delivered not in whispers, but in front of every person who believed Diana's smile and David's devotion. Marianne pressed her dress the night before the shower, soft gray, elegant, dignified. And in her purse, beside a pink gift bag with a handmade quilt, she slipped the printed phone records, folded just once. She'd never planned on becoming the center of a celebration, but sometimes truth demands a stage. And Marianne was ready. The baby shower was set in a whitewashed barn-turned venue that looked like something straight out of a magazine. Soft fairy lights strung along rustic beams, a wall of pastel balloons, and elegant glass tables adorned with pink rose centerpieces. It was beautiful, warm, carefully curated. But as Marianne stepped inside, the air caught in her throat like dust. Everything looked perfect, except the people. Sophie, radiant in her floral maternity dress, was glowing, surrounded by friends and cousins, smiling in the soft lens of a phone camera. James looked nervous, not quite jittery, but off. He greeted Marianne with a kiss on the cheek, but didn't meet her eyes. And then came Diana, wearing a blush-toned wrap dress that hugged her far too closely for a woman her age. Diana floated into the room as if the party were hers. Her perfume arrived a second before she did. Jasmine, rich and overbearing. When her eyes met Marianne's, they didn't flinch. In fact, Diana smiled wider than necessary and opened her arms. Mary Ann, you look lovely. Isn't this just the most special day? Mary Ann hugged her lightly, lips brushing the air, and stepped back. It is, she replied softly, eyes cold. David arrived 20 minutes later, just as the welcome toast was finishing. Mary Ann didn't miss the way he scanned the room first, as if seeking someone. He found her, Diana, and for just a split second, his shoulders dropped, as though relief had settled him. He hadn't seen Mary Ann watching, but she had. She always had. The event unfolded with choreographed joy. There were games, laughter, a slideshow of baby photos from both families. Even David participated in a diaper race with James, pretending like he didn't hate the attention. The guests laughed, oblivious. Mary Ann stayed on the sidelines, watching every exchange. It was when Diana bent down beside David to whisper something, her fingers lightly brushing his arm, that Mary Ann reached into her purse and felt the paper. It was smooth, warm. Her fingers had touched it all morning, again and again, like a silent promise to herself. She stood up, smoothing her dress. Then came the cake cutting. Everyone gathered in a loose half circle, cameras, raised, clapping, as Sophie and James posed behind the delicate white and pink confection. 3 generations of love, someone called out, gesturing for Mary Ann and Diana to join the photo. Mary Ann walked up slowly, standing on one side of Sophie, while Diana fluttered to the other. A photographer counted down. 1, 2. Mary Ann stepped forward slightly, just enough to interrupt the frame. I'm sorry, she said quietly but firmly. Before we take this photo, I think it's time to share something with the family. The room paused. Sophie turned, confused. What's wrong? David's eyes widened. And Diana froze. I didn't want to ruin your day, Mary Ann said to Sophie, voice calm. But this has gone on long enough. I won't protect their lies anymore. She pulled the folded paper from her purse and held it out steady. This is a log of phone calls between my husband and Diana. 86 calls in 2 months, including one after midnight. The room fell into a kind of silence that presses against your chest. James looked like someone had punched him in the stomach. Sophie reached for the paper with trembling hands. David stepped forward. Mary Ann, she held up her hand. Don't. Diana's face was no longer composed. Her mouth opened, then closed again. Her eyes darted toward the exits. There was no charm left. Sophie read the first few lines and shook her head in disbelief. Mom, is this real? Diana didn't answer. I asked you a question, Sophie shouted, her voice cracking like glass. Diana blinked. It's not what you think. We were just talking. James stepped back, away from everyone, away from his father. 86 calls, he whispered. That's not just talking. David finally spoke. It was a mistake. It started after your mother passed, Mary Ann. I didn't mean... But Mary Ann wasn't listening anymore. She turned to the stunned guests and nodded toward the cake. Please, don't let this ruin your day. Celebrate Sophie. Celebrate the baby. But don't ask me to pretend anymore. Then she turned around and walked out, her back straight, her pace slow. She didn't cry. Not yet. But the truth had been spoken. And in that moment, it was enough. The sound of the barn doors clicking shut behind Mary Ann was oddly satisfying. It wasn't the slam of a woman scorned. It was the quiet, final sound of a woman who had nothing left to prove. The wind outside was sharp, brushing against her cheeks like a welcome companion. She didn't turn back, not once. Inside the venue, however, was chaos. Sophie sat, still clutching the call log, her breathing uneven. Guests whispered in tight circles, some pretending not to look while others blatantly stared. Diana stood near the dessert table, her perfect posture wilting under the weight of dozens of eyes. David looked smaller than he ever had, shoulders hunched, face ashen, his tie suddenly too tight. James was the first to move. He walked past his father without a word, straight toward his wife. Sophie, he said, kneeling beside her. I didn't know. I swear to you. She didn't look up. Her thumb traced over one of the call times, 1:12 a.m. Did you ever notice anything? She asked quietly. No, he said too quickly. I mean, I thought Dad had been distant lately, but Diana, I never would have. Sophie looked up then. Her eyes, rimmed red, weren't just heartbroken. They were furious. You left me alone with her, James. I trusted her with my baby, with my life. The room grew quieter. David took a step forward, his voice shaking. Sophie, I never meant to. She stood abruptly. You don't get to speak to me. Please, Diana tried, approaching from the side. It wasn't serious. It was complicated. You're my mother, Sophie snapped, loud enough for the entire room to hear. And you slept with my father-in-law. The words hit like a hammer. Several guests visibly recoiled. My baby will never know this is normal, Sophie continued, voice trembling. She won't grow up thinking this kind of betrayal is okay. She won't see you as a role model. Not anymore. Diana's hand dropped to her side. Her face paled. James turned to his father. I looked up to you. You were the man I wanted to become. You taught me about loyalty, about commitment. You told me Mom was the love of your life. David's mouth opened, but no words came. James shook his head slowly. You disgust me. The photographer, unsure of what to do, silently began packing up his equipment. And then Sophie turned to the guests. I'm sorry, she said softly. This isn't the day I imagined. I'm going to step away for a while. But if you came to support my daughter, please stay and enjoy. Just give us space. She gently placed the call log down on the gift table, like evidence in a courtroom, and walked out, her husband silently following behind her. No one moved. For the next few minutes, the baby shower existed in a strange purgatory. The air smelled of sugar and betrayal. The music had stopped. Someone began blowing out the candles. Others picked up their coats, eyes cast downward. And then, slowly, people began to leave. Diana stood alone near the mimosa bar, arms crossed tightly over her chest, trembling despite the warmth of the room. No one said goodbye to her. David sat on a bench by the wall, elbows on his knees, staring into the distance. He looked like a man who had just been told his house had burned down, and he didn't know whether to run or just watch it fall. Meanwhile, Marianne sat alone in her car just a few blocks away. She didn't drive off immediately. She just stared out the windshield, watching the sunlight filter through the trees, feeling the aftershocks ripple through her chest. The silence inside her car wasn't empty. It was full of every moment she'd swallowed her instincts. Every time she'd bit her tongue to keep the peace. Every dinner party smile. Every denial. Every missed call that she'd excused. But now there was no need to excuse anything anymore. Truth had been released like a bird from its cage, and what happened next was no longer hers to manage. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope she had written days earlier. It was addressed to herself. Inside was a note. You are not crazy. You are not invisible. You are not broken. You are free. Tears welled, but they didn't fall. She folded the letter and tucked it into her coat pocket, then started the car. It was time to go home, not to pretend, but to begin again. The house felt different when Marianne returned that evening. It wasn't just quieter, it was emptier, as though something had been extracted from the air itself. The photos on the walls seemed to look back at her with questions she didn't yet know how to answer. She walked slowly through the hallway, heels clicking faintly on the hardwood, her hand grazing the doorframe to the kitchen where so many memories lived. She set her purse down with intention. Then she removed her wedding ring. It had never come off in 43 years. Her fingers looked foreign without it, naked, almost too light. But her hand, it felt stronger than it had in years. Marianne placed the ring inside a small ceramic dish by the sink, one she and David had bought on their honeymoon in Maine. She didn't flinch. That night she slept in the guest room. David didn't come home. She didn't call him. In the morning she brewed her coffee like always, 1 sugar, splash of milk, and sat on the back porch. The birds chirped loudly, almost aggressively, as though the world was trying to fill the silence with something brighter. She watched the sun rise over her small garden. Lavender, rosemary, the last of the spring tulips, life growing, even when everything else falls apart. At noon, the doorbell rang. Marianne didn't check the window first. She already knew. David stood on the front steps, his shoulders drooped like wet laundry. His gray hair looked uncombed, shirt wrinkled, and he held no flowers. No bags, just shame. She opened the door slowly. "Marianne," he said, voice hoarse. "Can I talk to you?" She stepped aside, wordlessly. He entered the house as if it belonged to someone else. His eyes landed on the missing ring dish, the change room arrangements, the untouched stack of mail. "I deserve everything," he began, eyes never meeting hers. "You do," she said simply. "I never planned to hurt you." "But you did. I was lonely. After your mother passed, you closed off. Diana was kind, familiar, and Marianne raised a hand. "Don't you dare blame grief." David fell silent. She continued, "You want to talk about loneliness? Try watching your husband get ready for a dinner that doesn't include you. Try cooking for two, only to eat alone. Try waking up in the middle of the night and smelling another woman's perfume on the coat rack." Tears gathered in David's eyes. He didn't wipe them. "I lost you a long time ago, didn't I?" he whispered. Marianne tilted her head. "You didn't lose me, David. You stopped seeing me." She let that hang between them like fog. He stepped forward slightly. "I'll end it. I'll cut off contact. I want to fix this." She let out a small, humorless laugh. "Fix what?" "Our marriage." "Our marriage?" Her voice cracked. "You shattered our foundation in front of our son, in front of Sophie. You chose her, David, not just once, over and over." His face fell. "I was foolish," he whispered. "You were cruel." He stood there, broken in his silence. Marianne's voice softened, but didn't waver. "This house, this life, it was built on respect, on honesty, on the kind of love that shows up every single day, even when it's hard. You replace that with stolen glances and midnight calls." "I miss you," he said. You miss the version of me that let things slide. She's gone." David lowered his head. "I need time," she said. "Alone. Not as your wife, not as your apology sponge, as myself." He nodded, then turned slowly toward the door. As he stepped outside, Marianne called out gently, "David?" He turned. "Tell Diana not to reach out. Not for forgiveness, not for clarity. I've given enough of myself already." He nodded once, quietly, and walked away. When the door closed behind him, Marianne didn't collapse. She didn't scream. She exhaled. It was long, and it was free. 2 weeks passed. Marianne kept herself busy, more than usual. She took long walks in the early morning, when the streets were still quiet, when the robins were just beginning to stir. She cleaned out drawers that hadn't been touched in years. She sorted photo albums, refiled documents, even repainted the laundry room. But the truth was, she was grieving, not for David, but for the woman she had been when she still believed in him. Some days she felt powerful, reborn. Other days, she stared blankly at the dinner table, where 2 chairs sat across from each other like ghosts. She hadn't heard from Sophie since the shower. James had texted once, "We're okay." Still processing. "Love you." Marianne hadn't replied yet. She didn't know how to be okay right now. Late one afternoon, she found herself at her writing desk, the one David had bought her for their 30th anniversary. It had sat unused for years. Dust clung to the edges, but inside the drawer were crisp, untouched sheets of stationery. She began writing letters, one to Sophie, one to James, one to herself. None of them were meant to be sent, not yet, maybe not ever. But the words poured out like water breaking through a dam. To Sophie, she wrote, "You are stronger than you. Think. I see it in the way you held your dignity that day. I hope your daughter grows up seeing you set the kind of boundaries we older women were once afraid to set. I'm sorry your mother failed you, but you did not fail yourself." To James, "You remind me of me, always trying to hold the family together, always assuming silence is love. But sometimes love has to speak, even when it shakes. You did the right thing walking out behind your wife. Never forget that." And to herself, "You were not naive. You were loving. You were not blind. You were trusting. You were not weak for staying. You were brave for leaving." Tears stained the corners of the pages. But it wasn't sorrow anymore. It was release. That evening, her doorbell rang again. This time it wasn't David. It was Sophie. She stood on the porch holding a small bundle wrapped in a pink baby blanket. Her face looked tired, but softer. Marianne opened the door with trembling hands. "Can I come in?" Sophie asked. Marianne nodded and stepped aside. They sat in the living room, silence settling between them like an old friend. "I wasn't sure if I should come," Sophie said finally, her voice thin. "But I needed to see you." Marianne studied her closely. "How are you?" Sophie exhaled. "Broken, but healing. James has been quiet, sad, but we're working through it. The baby's due in a few weeks." Marianne looked down at the tiny blanket. "Is that—" Sophie smiled faintly. "Just a gift. I found the quilt you made. I wanted to bring it back. It's beautiful, but I didn't want to use it without talking to you." Marianne reached over, touching the edge of the fabric with a soft reverence. "It was made for her. I meant every stitch." Sophie's eyes welled up. "Even after all this? Especially after all this?" They sat in stillness. Then softly, Sophie asked, "What will you do now?" Marianne looked out the window where the last of the sun glowed behind the trees. "I'll live," she said. "Not just exist. I'll travel, plant tomatoes, maybe even dye my hair red like I wanted to in college. I don't know. But whatever I do, it won't be in the shadow of a man who forgot my worth." Sophie reached out and took her hand. "I want you in her life," she whispered. "My daughter. She'll need women like you, women who speak, who walk away when silence no longer protects them." Marianne smiled for the first time in days. "I'd be honored." The pink blanket lay between them like a bridge, stitched in love, untouched by betrayal. A new chapter had begun, not built on repair, but on rebirth. Weeks turned to months, and the air grew warmer. Life crept back into routine. Only this time, it was Marianne's version of life, not dictated by Sunday roasts or what would David want, but by what she needed. She started attending a local writing group on Thursdays. She picked up watercolors again, shaky at first, but cathartic. She even took a solo trip to the coast for her 72nd birthday and sat barefoot in the sand with a cheap paperback and a bag of peach candies. For the first time in decades, she felt untethered. And oddly, that didn't feel lonely. It felt right. James and Sophie welcomed a baby girl in early summer. They named her Clara June. Marianne cried when she heard, not because the name was beautiful, though it was, but because Sophie had called and said simply, "We want her to carry the name of someone strong. June was your mother's name, right?" Marianne had barely whispered yes before the tears came. She visited the hospital the next day. David wasn't there. Clara was tiny, wrapped in a floral onesie with tufts of dark hair and fists that opened and closed like she was already learning to hold the world. When Marianne held her, something shifted. She didn't feel like a woman whose marriage had crumbled. She didn't feel like someone who had been betrayed, humiliated, or forgotten. She felt like a beginning. Sophie sat beside her, smiling through exhaustion. "We talked about what boundaries look like," she said softly, "and what healing really means. It's not about pretending it never happened. It's about making sure it doesn't happen again." Marianne nodded. "And it starts with telling the truth." Sophie looked down at Clara, and showing her that love doesn't mean staying silent. For a while, they just sat like that, 3 generations in a quiet, sun-drenched room. Later, as Marianne left the hospital, she found James waiting outside. He looked older, more tired, but more grounded too. "I owe you everything," he said quietly. "And I'm so sorry you had to carry that truth alone for so long." Marianne placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You didn't fail me, James. Your father did, and Diana did. But you stood by your wife. That's all I ever wanted, for you to be better than what we came from." He nodded, tears thick in his eyes. "Are you okay?" he asked. Marianne gave him a small smile. "I am now. And your daughter? She's going to be just fine." Back home, Marianne stood in her garden, watching the lavender sway in the breeze. It was full now, alive. She bent down and picked a few sprigs, tying them with twine, setting them by the windowsill. Her phone buzzed, a number she knew but hadn't seen in weeks. David. She stared at it until it stopped ringing. No voicemail. Just a quiet end to a call that should never have needed to happen. She deleted the number. She didn't block it. She just let it go. That night, she sat at her desk and pulled out her journal. At the top of a fresh page, she wrote, "Dear Clara, one day you'll learn that truth costs something. It always does. But silence? That costs more. Your grandmother once believed love meant swallowing discomfort. Now she knows better. And when you're old enough, I'll tell you about the day I stopped pretending and started living." She signed it simply. Grandma Marianne. Autumn arrived quietly that year. The trees outside Marianne's house began to turn. Rich amber, deep crimson, soft gold. The kind of season that reminded her of change without asking for permission. But for once, Marianne welcomed it. One chilly evening, she sat at her kitchen table, wrapped in a soft shawl, sipping spiced tea. The table was set for one, but she had placed a chair across from her anyway. Not for David, not out of habit, but because healing sometimes required honoring what used to be without inviting it to stay. She thought of all the years spent across from that chair, laughing, crying, hoping, and how it had slowly, cruelly turned into a stage for lies. She didn't hate it anymore. She just no longer needed it to be filled. That week she received a package in the mail, no return address, but the handwriting was familiar. David's. Her heart stuttered, but she didn't flinch. She opened it carefully. Inside was a single photo. Their family at a summer lake trip years ago, before everything, before Diana, before the cracks. Tucked beneath it was a short note. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I want you to know I've started therapy. I've moved out of the house. I'm not asking for you to come back. I just wanted you to know I'm trying to become the man I should have been." Marianne read it twice, then placed the photo in an old album, at the back. The note she burned in the fireplace that night, watching the flames curl around the edges until it was just ash. Not out of anger, but closure. The next day, Sophie invited her over for lunch. Just the two of them. Clara was nearly crawling now, chubby hands slapping the floor, big eyes constantly scanning the world like it owed her stories. Marianne couldn't stop smiling as she watched her, joy rising in her chest like something sacred. At the table, Sophie served soup and warm bread. They talked about books, about sleep schedules, about James's new job. They didn't speak of Diana or David. Until Sophie reached across the table and said, "I found a new therapist. I've been thinking a lot about generational choices." Marianne nodded. "Cycles don't break themselves." Sophie's eyes glistened. "I just keep thinking, what if she grows up and finds herself in the same position we were in? What do I tell her?" Marianne looked at her granddaughter, then back at Sophie. "You tell her to pay attention to silence, to notice the moments when her instincts whisper something isn't right. You teach her that love without respect isn't love. It's dependency. And you remind her that leaving doesn't make her weak. It makes her whole." Sophie exhaled deeply. "I hope I can be strong for her." Marianne smiled gently. "You already are." Before she left, Sophie handed her a small envelope. "For you," she said. "Open it at home." That night, back at her kitchen table, Marianne opened the envelope. Inside was a card. On the front, a watercolor painting of lavender. Inside, in Sophie's neat handwriting, "We'd like you to be Clara's godmother, because when the world tried to break you, you showed us what rising looks like." Marianne closed her eyes and held the card to her chest. The chair across from her was still empty. But her heart, it had never been fuller.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.